View Ngoi 148, exposing police misconduct. Woman's brave stand in public plaza. What gives you the right? That was the only question anyone remembered asking, out loud or silently, on that quiet afternoon in North Haven Park, where families usually gathered with folding chairs, joggers ran laps without thinking, and tourists posed near the bronze sculpture of a nameless soldier staring into nothing. But that day, no one noticed the sculpture. What they did notice was a tall man in uniform gripping the arm of a woman in a red blouse, then reaching, not for her ID, not for a weapon, but for the waistband of her skirt, not just touching it, tugging it, lifting it. Some people gasped, others froze, as if unsure whether what they saw was real or just a misunderstanding caught mid-movement. And then someone whispered, "Did he just?" The woman didn't flinch. She didn't yell. She didn't move. And maybe that's what made it worse. The stillness, the fact that her silence wasn't compliance but something else entirely. Something that made even the birds stop their sound. Like the whole park held its breath, waiting to see if the rules everyone thought were invisible had finally been snapped in two. Because when a man in uniform does something like that, in public without fear, it's never just about a skirt. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, we dive deep into true stories that walk the line between silence and justice. Real incidents that reveal the systems we live under, the people who challenge them, and the moments where everything changes. If that's the kind of story you want more of, make sure to subscribe, tap the bell so you don't miss what comes next, and share this with someone who still believes what happens in plain sight should be left unspoken. Now, take a breath, because what you're about to hear isn't just about one woman or one park. It's about the quiet rage hiding in routine, and the day a system realized it couldn't look away anymore. It didn't start with violence. It started with a routine check. At least that's what they called it when Officer Brent Halley first approached the woman. No sirens, no raised voices, just the sound of his boots crunching gravel and a hand hovering near his radio. Her name was Sarah. At least that's what the ID in her wallet said. She had no criminal record, no warrant, no missing tag on her license plate. What she had was a calmness that didn't sit right with the kind of authority used to being feared. She had been standing beside the park bench, reading something on her phone when he asked, "Can I speak with you for a second?" No explanation, no introduction, just the assumption that she'd comply. She said nothing. Not because she couldn't speak, but because she knew how quickly words could be turned into weapons when spoken to the wrong person in the wrong uniform. He stepped closer. Too close. Close enough that her refusal to step back looked like defiance. That's when he touched her, not to restrain, not to search, but to humiliate, to remind her of the unspoken hierarchy that still crawled beneath the skin of this country like old, untreated wounds. He gripped the fabric of her skirt right at the hem, lifted it an inch, maybe two, and smiled. That smile, the kind people only wear when they think no one can stop them, split his face like a mask torn open. But someone did see. 3 teenagers. Near the skate ramp, a mother with her toddler, an old man walking his dog. And just like that, a moment meant to be small and quiet and forgotten became something else entirely. One of the teens pulled out his phone. The screen glowed. It didn't matter how steady his hands were. What mattered was that he captured it, the touch, the look on her face. The second Officer Halley realized he had crossed a line that wouldn't fade just because no one screamed. And Sarah? She didn't scream because she didn't need to. Her stillness was louder than outrage. Her silence wasn't submission, it was a signal. And it didn't take long for the signal to reach further than anyone expected. The video hit local forums within an hour. No captions, no context. Just a still frame with a single line typed in bold. When does the badge stop being protection and start being a weapon? It spread like a bruise, slow at first, then sudden. By midnight, it had crossed state lines. By dawn, it was news. But what people didn't see, what the camera never caught, was what happened in the seconds after. Hallie pulled his hand away. Sarah reached into her bag slowly. No rush, no fear. She pulled out a black leather case and opened it. Inside wasn't pepper spray. It wasn't a camera. It was her credentials. Federal Oversight, Civil Rights Bureau. She didn't say a word. She just let him see it. And something in his face changed. Not shame, not guilt, just cold, creeping. Recognition that the system he'd relied on to protect him from consequences had just introduced itself with a new face. And it was hers. What followed wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning, and it didn't happen in courtrooms or press conferences. It started in whispers behind locked precinct doors, in group chats where officers deleted messages faster than they could be screenshotted, in late-night phone calls between superiors, trying to decide how to bury what had already been born into public view. But Sarah didn't need to shout. Her presence was enough, and every time someone asked, "Who does she think she is?" they were already answering their own question. Because deep down, they knew the real danger wasn't what she said. It was what she didn't need to say anymore. This isn't the kind of story that ends with a single apology or a press release. It's the kind that sticks, that shifts something, because it asks the kind of question that doesn't need an answer, only a mirror. What gives you the right? It wasn't the kind of place where anything big ever happened. Not riots, not marches, not protests, just a little square tucked into the belly of an old city. One of those places that tried very hard to pretend nothing ever needed to change. At midday, it was always the same. Vendors setting up mismatched umbrellas, kids kicking soccer balls near the church steps, elderly couples walking the same loop they'd walked for years, and conversations slipping between accents and languages, without needing permission. You'd hear French from the bakery, Spanish from the flower stall, Portuguese when someone cursed at a broken cartwheel, and English layered on top of it all, the kind tourists used, slightly too loud, slightly unsure. It was a space that looked safe because it felt familiar, and that was the trick. Familiar doesn't always mean fair. Sarah had been to this place before. Not this exact square, maybe, but hundreds like it. She knew the rhythm. The easy smiles from vendors, the too long stares from men who thought women walking alone were public property, the way a community could wrap you in warmth one moment and spit you out the next. She didn't dress like someone trying to blend in. She dressed like herself. A navy coat, gold detailing on the buttons, wide-legged pants, hair wrapped in a scarf patterned like broken glass. She walked like someone who wasn't searching for anything. And people noticed, some admired, most watched, a few whispered. But no one intervened when the officer approached her near the eastern edge of the plaza. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't yell. He asked a question he didn't really mean. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" He already had. His hand was on her arm before her mouth could form a response. A soft grip, not forceful, but not something she could ignore. She turned slowly, met his eyes, and that pause, just 3 seconds, was enough to shift the temperature of the air around them. Because silence isn't always surrender, sometimes it's warning. He asked for her papers. She raised an eyebrow. Why? Not defensive, just curious. He didn't answer directly. "We've had reports," he said. She waited for more. There was no more. And then came the pivot. "You dress very formal for a casual area." Pause. Most tourists don't wear coats like that. And just like that, it stopped being about security and started being about permission, as if her outfit was a question and he was the answer, as if her presence required explanation. He gestured toward her scarf. "You hiding something under there?" And before she could respond, his fingers twitched, barely a motion, barely an action, and brushed the fabric. Not a search, not an accident, A performance. A test. No one screamed. One woman gasped. A man glanced, then looked away. Someone adjusted their headphones. Another lit a cigarette. The world didn't stop, it just stuttered. The seconds didn't rush to protect her. They stalled, unsure if what they were witnessing was wrong enough to warrant discomfort. But someone recorded. A girl, maybe 20, maybe younger, stood frozen behind the fruit stall. Her phone angled like she was texting, but her eyes locked on what was unfolding. And in that moment, something irreversible happened. Not on the street, not in Sierra, but in the digital archive of the world, because the truth didn't need a camera. It just needed a witness. The officer, his name would later be confirmed as Staff Sergeant Owen K. Mercer, noticed the shift in attention. He turned his head, saw the girl, narrowed his eyes, and backed off. Not from Sierra, from the moment, but damage doesn't ask for permission to settle in. It already had. Sarah didn't say a word. She didn't have to. She pulled a badge from her inside pocket. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear. Internal Affairs, International Oversight Division. Mercer blinked, laughed, a nervous, shaky thing that didn't belong to confidence. "You got jokes," he muttered, then turned back toward his post without a single apology. But the plaza had shifted. Something in the noise, voices, footsteps, casual laughter had bent. Sarah didn't move. Not yet. She knew better than to walk away too fast. She waited. Let the moment finish itself. Then turned slowly, calmly, and walked toward the center of the square where the cafe umbrellas bled red into the afternoon light. The video hit social media that evening. Just 27 seconds, no voiceover, no captions, just silence and a gesture. A hand reaching, without cause, and a face that didn't flinch. By midnight, the square had a name online, Mercer's Stage, and people weren't asking what happened. They were asking how often it had, because when something looks that practiced, it rarely starts with one, and that's when the emails began. Quiet ones at first, anonymous, fragments. This isn't the first time. Check footage from last October. He asked me the same question, then longer messages, screenshots, HR complaints closed within 24 hours, audio clips forwarded to journalists. Not a movement. Not yet, but momentum, the kind that starts under the floorboards before the ceiling caves in. Inside the department, the tone shifted fast. No press statements, no internal apologies, just a meeting, closed doors, pulled shades, and a single question whispered from one ranking officer to another. How long do we pretend this didn't happen? No one answered out loud, because they all knew pretending only worked before the cameras started rolling. After that, the silence is the story. The following morning, there was a shift in posture across the precinct. Not in policy, not in formal action. Those always come later, often too late, but in the way officers held their coffee cups, the way they avoided each other's eyes when passing in the hallway, the way some stopped themselves mid-joke and didn't quite finish the punchline. Because once a moment becomes public, silence stops being safe. It becomes a choice, and that choice starts to spread. Officer Mercer didn't come in for his shift, no formal reason given. Just a note left. On the desk, personal leave, but the chatter didn't stop. In fact, it multiplied. A junior officer named Linley told someone at a bar he wasn't surprised. Said he'd seen something like that back in spring. Not the same, he clarified quickly, but similar enough. And that was the phrase that stuck. Similar enough. Enough to blur the line between doubt and knowledge. Enough to realize it had never been a single incident. It had been an environment. The girl who recorded the video posted a follow-up. Her name was Amelia. She added context, said she had frozen, scared to say anything, scared to move. But she filmed it because her instinct said, this isn't normal, even though no one else was reacting like it wasn't. She didn't think it would go viral. She just didn't want to forget. And that honesty, raw, simple, human, struck a nerve. People didn't blame her for staying quiet. They thanked her for noticing. 3 days later, the plaza saw its first organized presence. Small, unassuming, not quite a protest, just a group of people standing together near the spot it happened. Some held signs, most didn't. They weren't shouting, they weren't blocking roads, they were just there. And for a moment, the air felt different, heavier, like history had decided to pause in that square and ask, are you ready to remember this? By the end of the week, more stories surfaced. A woman from the Northern District described being followed to her car by an officer after a noise complaint. A trans man shared that his ID was confiscated and never returned. A teenage boy recounted being pinned to the wall behind a grocery store and told to watch his attitude. None of the stories were loud, none were explosive, but together they formed a weight that couldn't be brushed off. Patterns don't lie. They just wait to be seen. Inside Internal Affairs, Sarah didn't speak to the media. She didn't release a statement. She showed up, quiet, focused, with a clipboard and a list. Not just of names, but of dates. Incidents long marked as resolved. Complaints coded as unsubstantiated. She didn't wave them like accusations. She read them like instructions, because what happens on the street is only ever the last domino. The real failure always lives in the paperwork. The first meeting with command staff lasted 3 hours. No one shouted. No chairs were thrown. It was worse than that. It was calm, cold, as if the conversation had already been rehearsed 100 times behind closed doors. But then Sarah said something that wasn't in the script. She leaned forward, looked directly at the precinct chief and said, "You don't need to explain what went wrong. I need to know what you thought was working." The room held still, because questions like that don't demand answers. They expose the fact that answers were never the point. In that moment, the issue wasn't just Mercer. It was the structure that raised him, trained him, promoted him, protected him. A system that treated no formal complaint as proof of innocence, rather than a sign people had stopped believing complaints made a difference. Meanwhile, the mayor's office issued its usual line, "We take all reports seriously," but offered no commitment to action. A columnist called it administrative choreography, the kind of language polished enough to sound responsible, but hollow enough to echo with every crisis before it. And yet, change was happening, not from above, but from between the lines. A local professor started a public timeline, connecting every documented misconduct incident from the last 5 years. A group of students built a map with pins for each complaint that shared a common detail. Officer Mercer had responded. It wasn't long before someone asked the question aloud. What does accountability look like if the institution only acts when caught? And that became the heartbeat of what followed. Because no one was demanding perfection, they were asking for presence, for someone to notice, to stop, to speak up before the video, before the hashtags, before the press. Not after. 10 days after the incident, Sarah returned to the plaza, not alone. With her came a small team, data analysts, civilian review staff, 2 quiet legal observers. They weren't there to make arrests. They were there to listen, to record, to make presence visible. She stood in the same spot where Mercer had grabbed her coat and spoke, not to the crowd, not to cameras, but to a man selling used books. "Did you see what happened last week?" she asked. He nodded. "Did you speak about it?" He shook his head. She didn't scold, she didn't shame. She just said, "Okay, let's begin here." And that was the difference. Sarah wasn't asking people to be heroes. She was asking them to be honest about what they saw, about what they feared, about what silence had cost them, because silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's the presence of consent. And for the first time, people were realizing how loud that consent had been. Policy changes followed, slowly, reluctantly. A new protocol required all field officers to wear dual camera vests with audio encryption stored off-site. An oversight board was proposed, this time not staffed by former officers, but by civilians with subpoena power. The union pushed back, accused the city of betrayal, but the public had already turned the page. By the third week, Mercer released a statement through his lawyer. It read, in part, "I did not intend to cause discomfort. My actions have been misinterpreted." And that was it. No ownership, no apology, just more distance, just more insulation. But by then, it no longer mattered what he said. The moment had outgrown him. The issue was never just him. A young woman named Elise, who had never been to a protest before, stood outside City Hall holding a sign that read, "We're not here to ruin lives. We're here to stop patterns." That became the unofficial slogan of the movement. It wasn't angry, it wasn't soft, it was exact. In the weeks that followed, the plaza didn't forget. Tourists still passed through, vendors still sold fruit, kids still kicked soccer balls, but something had settled into the cracks between the cobblestones, a knowing, a presence, a reminder, and every so often someone new would walk through, maybe from another city, another background, another language, and pause at the eastern edge, where no plaque had been placed, no monument raised, just space, and someone nearby might lean over and say, "That's where it happened." No drama, no ceremony, just memory, alive and standing, refusing to vanish. Because that's how stories like this stay with us. Not in the headlines, not in the charges filed, but in the shift, the way we look at power, the way we watch each other, the way we finally ask out loud, "What gives you the right?" Her name was Amina Salim, and people always asked where she was from, even when they didn't say it out loud. There was something in the way she stood, shoulders squared but never stiff, eyes that didn't dart around but scanned like they already knew what was missing. That made people curious. She looked like someone who didn't flinch easily. Someone who carried something more than just herself. She wasn't tall, she wasn't flashy, but she walked into a room the way some people walk into a courtroom, measured, exact, like truth had a weight you couldn't fake, and she'd been carrying it long enough to know where it hurts. She was born in Marseille, but raised between 4 countries. Egypt for family, Germany for schooling, Canada for safety, and the US for its contradictions. Her passport had more stamps than her wardrobe had dresses, but none of that told you who she was. You had to watch her listen. That's where it showed. She didn't interrupt. She didn't nod just to move things along. She let silence hang, let discomfort settle. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't to answer. It was to reframe. Most people never even noticed it happening. They just found themselves seeing something differently, and somehow she had been the pivot. She didn't dress like a stereotype, but she didn't erase where she came from either. That morning in the plaza, her scarf was ink black, the fabric thin and edged with grey stitching. Her coat was cut close but moved when she did. Everything about her said precision, intent. She didn't decorate. She didn't explain. And she didn't need to, because she wasn't there to prove she belonged. She was there to document who thought she didn't. By title, Amina was an international human rights investigator. Her focus was field observation, especially in democratic states where abuse wasn't systemic by policy, but persistent by habit. She was sent not to places with collapsed systems, but to places with systems that pretended they didn't need fixing. She knew the pattern, the handshake, the polite tension in meetings, the smiles stretched too tightly across nervous men's faces. But that wasn't where she did her best work. Her best work was in alleys and corridors, in the moments just before someone thought no one else was looking. She wasn't trained to break stories. She was trained to notice what didn't belong in stories that had already been told too many times. The day she arrived in the city, no one welcomed her. There was no team, no car, no formal briefing. She had chosen that. She preferred to enter like any other civilian, to blend in just enough to be dismissed. Because the second they knew who she was, the story shifted. People cleaned up their words, pulled their sleeves down, smiled too much, and that meant the truth had already slipped out the back. She had learned that lesson young. Her father had been a political journalist in Alexandria, sharp, unshakable, the kind of man whose writing once shut down a provincial court. He disappeared one year when she was 9, not taken, just gone. No answers, no search. Her mother never called him a martyr, just said he asked too many questions and waited too long for others to care. Amina never forgot that. That silence didn't just kill stories, it killed people, so she made a career out of refusing to stay silent. But even with all that, she never liked being seen. Visibility was dangerous. It invited attention she didn't need. That's why she never gave interviews, why she deleted social media years ago. Her name floated around in legal briefings, policy memos, closed-door commissions, but in public she could pass as almost anything. Student, traveler, NGO, volunteer, and she liked it that way, until Mercer grabbed her arm. That touch wasn't just personal, it was professional. It breached both spaces she worked so hard to keep separate. And in that moment she wasn't sure which part of her reacted first, the woman or the witness. But she knew instantly it would have to be both. She didn't flinch, she didn't yell, she logged it, not in her mind, in her muscle. In the angle of his wrist, the tone of his voice, the way he shifted his weight to block her path. That was how she stored information, not with notebooks, with sensation. She could recall entire incidents by the feeling they left behind in her spine. That's why her reports were so precise, not because she was detailed, but because she had trained herself to live in moments that most people tried to escape. Later, when asked why she didn't defend herself physically, she would say, because his reaction wasn't the threat. The reaction from the system that trained him to act that way, that's what I needed to see. And she did, in full, from the way his partner said nothing, to the way bystanders froze instead of helping, to the way a superior officer later tried to debrief her like she had somehow caused the incident by not answering fast enough. She saw all of it. And every second, she let it imprint. She hadn't always been this way. There was a time, early in her career, when she had tried to play it soft, smiled more, nodded politely, wrote reports in passive voice to seem less aggressive. But none of it worked. People just ignored her findings, then quoted her conclusions. Later, without credit, she stopped playing polite, stopped trimming her tone, started writing names in bold and calling patterns what they were. Systemic. What made Amina effective wasn't that she was brave. It was that she knew fear too well to pretend it didn't exist. She had seen it in the eyes of women before raids, in the hands of children clutching expired ID cards, in the soft retreat of men who once promised to testify but couldn't look her in the eye when they backed out. She didn't resent them. She documented them too, because fear is part of the story, and pretending otherwise only makes the silence thicker. When the footage of Mercer spread, Amina didn't post anything. She didn't ask for edits or statements. She watched. She took note of which media outlets framed it as unclear context, and which ones named it what it was: assault. She watched how fast the department issued vague reassurances and how slowly it moved on internal reviews. She didn't interfere. She observed. Because the next steps weren't hers alone. They belonged to the city now, to what it would or wouldn't do with what it had seen. But inside her apartment that night, she sat alone at her kitchen table, hands still shaking, not from anger, but from restraint. Because no matter how trained she was, no matter how many cases she'd processed, it never stopped feeling personal. And that's what people forget, that every professional holding back their voice is still a person carrying a wound. She didn't want revenge. She didn't even want an apology. What she wanted was harder. She wanted exposure, honest, public, unedited. She wanted the system to admit, not just that Mercer was wrong, but that it built him, trained him, covered for him, repeated him. That was the only outcome that meant anything, because it meant someone finally stopped looking at misconduct as an exception and started seeing it as design. And so, when the commission requested her full statement, she submitted it in 3 versions. One for public record, one for legal review, and one handwritten just for herself. In that last one, she didn't use legal terms. She didn't cite procedures. She wrote what she remembered, the sound of the gravel under his boots, the way his fingers touched the edge of her coat, the tightness in her chest when no one moved. She wrote it not because it would help the case, but because it helped her remember that she was real, that she wasn't just a data point or a headline. She was a person. And what happened to her had happened to thousands of others whose names would never appear in any report. Amina never thought of herself as a symbol. Symbols get erased too easily. Statues get toppled. Names get left off of final reports. She didn't want to represent anything. She just wanted the system to look her in the face and admit what it had done. Not to her, but to everyone like her, the ones whose stories didn't go viral, the ones who didn't get filmed, the ones who got asked where they were really from every time they stood too tall in a room they weren't expected to enter. In the days after the incident, she was followed, but not just by the usual surveillance. The looks changed. Some people stared longer, others tried not to look at all. Strangers stopped her to ask if she was that woman. A few said thank you. Most just stood awkwardly, unsure what to say now that the internet had made her real. She didn't perform grace. She didn't smile to put them at ease. She let their discomfort sit where it belonged, because that discomfort wasn't her fault. It was the world adjusting to a truth it had spent too long denying. What struck her most wasn't the public reaction. It was the silence from inside the system. No direct apology, no acknowledgement from command, just bureaucracy pretending this hadn't already become something bigger than policy. She had seen this before, how institutions handle damage, not by addressing it, but by slowing it down until people stop paying attention. But she knew the clock. She knew how long people stayed outraged. And she knew exactly how to make sure this wouldn't fade. She went back to work, not in some dramatic return moment, but in the quiet, deliberate way she always had, reviewing body cam footage from unrelated incidents, auditing old complaints, reading transcripts line by line. She didn't treat her own case as more important. She folded it in, because the most powerful thing she could do was show how normal it was, how common, how systemically possible. And when she presented her findings, she didn't raise her voice. She let the document speak. She didn't accuse. She described, and it was impossible to look away. Her colleagues, even the skeptical ones, couldn't deny the pattern. Mercer wasn't the first. He wasn't even the worst. He was just the one who got caught, and that made him useful, not as an example, but as evidence. Amina knew how to build a case without ever needing to explain her pain. She used their own files, their own timestamps, their own protocols. She knew the language they trusted, and she turned it back on them like a mirror. But outside the office, the story was different. She received hate mail, not the kind that comes from loud racists, but the coded kind. Messages from concerned citizens warning her about being too political. Emails accusing her of dividing communities. Even some media segments questioning her credibility, not based on her actions, but her appearance. One headline read, "Woman involved in officer incident previously linked to international organizations." as if global experience was a threat, as if being informed made her suspicious. She didn't answer any of them. She didn't need to. Every attack made her case stronger, because they weren't denying what happened. They were punishing her for not walking away quietly. That, too, became part of the record. But she wasn't immune. Late at night, in the hours after the interviews and before the statements, she sometimes sat in her room and stared at the ceiling, wondering what it would feel like to be believed without a file folder full of proof. To just say, "This happened," and have people believe her without documents, without footage, without a 27-second video to make it real. That's what the others didn't see. That behind the precision and posture was a woman exhausted by how much she had to remember just to stay credible. Her mother called her one night, not to talk about the case, just to ask if she was eating, if she was sleeping, if she had spoken to God. Amina smiled. She never knew how to answer that question. Her mother didn't care about politics or procedure. She cared about her daughter, not being turned into a symbol people cheered for until they got bored. She reminded Amina that staying silent sometimes wasn't cowardice. It was survival. But Amina didn't want to survive this. She wanted to change it. And then there was Khaled. He wasn't her partner, not exactly. More like someone she had once been close to, drifted from, and recently come back around to. He didn't ask her what happened. He just sent a message that said, "They think you're alone. Don't let them be right." It wasn't romantic. It was real. The kind of message that doesn't try to fix anything, just reminds you that someone's still watching, still ready. They met once in a quiet cafe after things had calmed down publicly. He didn't bring up the plaza. He brought her coffee, sat beside her without a word, and after a long silence said, "You've got this look in your eyes again, like you're ready to burn the whole thing down." She didn't laugh. She just said, "Not burn, just unmask." He nodded. "That's worse for them." Amina wasn't fearless. She just didn't allow fear to decide who she was. And in the weeks that followed, as investigations expanded, as committees were formed, as the city began to realize this wasn't going away, she never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence was already doing what shouting couldn't. It was making avoidance impossible. When the city council finally called a public hearing, she sat in the back. No grand entrance, no spotlight. She listened to the testimonies, to the dodging, to the performative concern from people who had ignored reports like hers for years. And then, when invited to speak, she stood up, walked to the microphone, and said only this: "If the only time you believe something is when there's a video, the problem isn't the lie. It's the silence you trained yourselves to hear as truth." Then she stepped back. She didn't stay for applause. She didn't wait for reaction. She left. Not because she didn't care, but because her job wasn't to win. It was to record, to confront, to document what people did when no one was filming and what they pretended to care about when everyone was. In the months that followed, reforms were proposed. Some passed, others were stalled. Mercer never returned to duty, but Amina never mentioned his name again. Because it was never just about him. It was about the system that built him, and the community that let it happen again and again, until one woman refused to walk away quietly, and in that refusal, she didn't become a hero. She didn't want to be. She became something harder to ignore, a witness, one who saw everything, and made sure no one could pretend they didn't. It happened so quickly that most people didn't process it until it was already over. The man in the Navy security uniform, badged but barely trained, one of those officers placed more for presence than authority, stepped in front of her like it was routine. No emergency, no threat, just presence. His name was Alan Reed, mid-30s, built like someone who used to work out but now carried power in his posture more than his muscle. His tone wasn't aggressive, not at first. It was casual in that, condescending way some men speak when they think a woman should be grateful they're not yelling. "Hey," he said, loud enough for people around to hear, "I need to check what's under that coat." Amina turned her head slowly, the way you do when you want to make sure what you heard was real. She didn't look startled. She looked tired. The kind of tired that had heard that tone too many times, in too many places, dressed up as too many different reasons. She said nothing. Not at first. Just stared at him. Waiting. Sometimes silence is the clearest answer a person can give. But he didn't take it that way. He took it as challenge, or worse, dismissal. "Ma'am," he pressed, "I said I need to see what you're carrying under your coat. You're standing close to a secure entry zone. You match a vague description. That last sentence dropped like a rotten floorboard. Vague description. 3 syllables used so often to justify profiling that they no longer required logic. Amina didn't reach for anything. She didn't step back. Her hands stayed at her sides. Her voice, when it finally came, was steady. "Is that a request? Or an order?" That should have been the end of it. A pause, a step back, a reconsideration. But Reed wasn't built for de-escalation. He was built for control. He reached forward, not fast, not violent, just entitled, and pulled the edge of her coat open with 2 fingers, like peeling back packaging he assumed was his to inspect. There was no weapon, no suspicious object, just a folded document case, clipped under her arm. But that wasn't the point. The point was the touch, the publicness of it. The way he didn't ask, didn't explain, didn't even pretend to follow procedure, just reached, like she was furniture, like she was a question he had the right to answer with his hands. And then came the silence, not from her, from the people around them. The first to notice was a boy, 12, maybe 13, who stopped mid-bite into a melting popsicle. He nudged his younger brother, then stood still, eyes locked on the scene like he was trying to decide if he should say something, do something, or just remember it in case no one else did. An elderly woman sitting on the nearby bench glanced up from her knitting, lips parting slightly in disbelief, her needles frozen mid-row. Her son, maybe in his 40s, placed a protective hand on her shoulder without taking his eyes off the officer. He didn't move to stop it, but he didn't look away either. 2 tourists nearby, one from Ireland, the other from Korea, stopped taking selfies and slowly lowered their phones. One of them whispered, "Is that allowed?" but didn't finish the thought. A hot dog vendor leaned against his cart, tongs still in hand, watching the scene like he'd seen too many like it before, but never this close. He didn't say a word. He didn't shout. He just shifted his weight from one leg to the other, like the discomfort had physically rooted itself in his spine. A little girl holding a helium balloon pointed and asked her mum what was happening. The mum turned her away and said, "Nothing, baby. Just keep walking." But the girl kept looking. Kids do that. They notice before adults are ready to name. The moment stretched. It didn't explode. There was no violence, no pushback, just the thick, ugly realization hanging in the air that someone had touched a stranger's body in public under the protection of a uniform, and no one stopped. Him, not even with their words. And maybe that was the worst part, the collective hesitance, the group pause, the way people waited for someone else to decide if what they were seeing was wrong enough to matter. But then came the phone, not from Amina, from the teen boy, the one with the half-eaten popsicle now melting down his wrist. He didn't raise it dramatically, he just angled it upward. Quiet, intentional. A single motion that turned the moment from invisible to permanent. The officer noticed. He didn't stop, but his posture shifted, his shoulders tightened, his voice dropped an octave. "Put that away," he said without turning. But the boy didn't, because something in his gut told him this was the kind of moment you film now and understand later. Amina didn't move, didn't flinch. She stared at Reed and asked again, "Is this protocol?" Her voice was calm, but in the way a blade is calm before it's drawn. Reed blinked. For the first time, doubt flickered across his expression. Not guilt, not shame. Just the sudden awareness that this might not disappear the way it usually does. "We can take this inside," he said quickly. "Clear it up privately." But she didn't move. "No," she said, "we'll do it right here. That way everyone who watched you touch me without consent gets to hear what you think gives you the right." That's when the tension snapped, not with shouting, not with a fight, just a collective inhale from the crowd that meant someone finally said it. And with that breath came movement. A vendor stepped forward slightly, arms crossed. The old woman lowered her knitting to her lap. The teenager steadied his phone. A new witness, a man in business attire who had just exited a nearby building, stood next to Amina without saying a word, his body angled like a shield, not touching her, just there. Reed looked around, saw what had shifted, and took one step back. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," he said. Amina's expression didn't change. "No, I'm making it visible." And that was the moment Reed knew. Not that he was wrong. He probably still didn't believe that. But that he had lost control. And that was enough to make him retreat. He stepped aside, muttered something about false alarms and overreactions, and walked back toward the building's entrance like nothing had happened. But something had, and it was too late to undo it. Because someone had seen, because someone had filmed, because the crowd, however small, had stayed long enough to witness. Something that used to vanish before it became proof. And Amina didn't walk away like a victim. She walked away like a ledger, balanced, not angry, just ready, because she knew the system wouldn't collapse from one incident. But it might flinch. The shift didn't happen with a press conference. It came with an email, not an official one either, just a single message from a temporary domain, subject line all lowercase. "Listen to this." Attached was a 5-minute audio clip, time-stamped, clipped and clear, no music, no static, just two voices in a room that shouldn't have been recorded. One of them was unmistakably Alan Reed, the other a superior officer, male, calm, dangerous in the way practiced. Power is dangerous. The conversation wasn't about safety. It wasn't about procedure. It was about strategy, damage control, how to minimize civilian narrative and preempt escalation, how to question her credibility without triggering a discrimination. Backlash. The words weren't shouted. They were laid out plainly, methodically, like logistics before a media war. And when it leaked, nothing could stop what followed. Within 12 hours, the clip was on 3 major platforms, one of them international. By the next morning, news anchors were quoting the transcript line for line. It wasn't rage that followed. It was calculation. Communities didn't scream. They started building lists. Who said what? Who stayed quiet? Who signed which report? The silence became data, and that was more dangerous than protest. At the center of it all was a name that hadn't been public until now. Adrian Holt, not a politician, not a police chief, a federal compliance officer specializing in interagency oversight, the kind of person who didn't do interviews, didn't get tagged in viral posts, didn't trend. She just showed up with files. Adrienne wasn't there to be liked. She was there to ask questions that made people uncomfortable in rooms designed for comfort. When she arrived at the City Commission building, she didn't announce herself. She walked through security, nodded once, and entered the hearing room with a binder thick enough to make people shift in their seats. She didn't need cameras. She brought evidence. Her presence alone changed the temperature. Amina recognized it instantly. Not because Adrienne said anything, but because she said nothing in a room full of people trying too hard to appear in control. Her silence was surgical, measured, the kind that didn't react until the exact moment it became necessary. And when she spoke, it wasn't with outrage. It was with clarity. "Before anyone presents conclusions," Adrian began, "I'd like the record to include a sequence of interactions between Officer Reed and 3 other civilians spanning the last fiscal year, 2 of which were dismissed without review." A city official tried to interrupt. She held up a hand, not aggressively, just with the firm authority of someone who had never been told no without consequence. "I'm not here for speculation. I'm here because we have patterns, documented, repeated, ignored." She laid 3 case files on the table, side by side. They weren't dramatic, they weren't new, but they were real, and now they were. Public Reed, still on paid leave, was no longer the focus. The attention had shifted upward. Who trained him? Who reviewed his conduct? Who decided those past incidents weren't worth disciplinary action? Adrienne didn't point fingers. She traced structures, made people follow the trail they had spent years learning how to hide. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. But every word cut deeper than shouting ever could. And then came the footage, not the viral video. This was different. This one hadn't been meant for the public. It came from a maintenance camera at the northwest edge of the plaza, installed years ago and mostly forgotten. It didn't show the incident clearly, but it showed the officer moments before the approach. It showed him watching Amina for 5 minutes without moving. It showed the exact moment he decided she was a target. Not reacting to threat, not responding to behavior, just choosing. And that broke whatever defense remained, because intent is harder to deny when it's captured on video, especially when it matches the behavior you claimed was instinct. And suddenly, what had been framed as a misunderstanding now had a history, a pattern, a context, and a camera angle. The commission scheduled an emergency session. City officials shuffled papers like they were trying to fold their guilt. Inside legal language. But people were watching now, not just activists, ordinary citizens, teachers, retirees. Teens like Matteo, who sat quietly in the back row and didn't speak until the very end, when a committee member asked if the incident had really affected the public that deeply. He stood up, held his phone, and played the audio. Not loudly. Just enough for everyone to hear Reed's voice again, this time in a different room, saying, "No one cares what happens if it doesn't bleed." And then Matteo asked, "Do you still not care?" There was no applause, just a silence that didn't ask permission. Adrian turned to the board. "I think we're done pretending this is isolated," she said. And that became the unofficial headline. But inside the department, chaos brewed. Not externally, internally. The kind of tension that turns desks into battlefields and emails into shields. Officers began choosing sides. Some refused to speak. Others forwarded anonymous documents. A junior officer leaked a redacted complaint filed by a black civilian 3 months prior. A different unit head found themselves removed from internal review after a series of missing logs surfaced. It wasn't revolution. It was rot, finally exposed. And Amina, she didn't insert herself. She didn't raise her profile. She kept working, quietly, diligently, reviewing everything she had already known, but now had the weight of public awareness behind it. What changed wasn't her motivation. It was her position. Now people listened, not because they believed her more, but because denying her meant denying what they themselves had now seen. She became necessary, and in systems built on denial, necessity is power. The moment the commission declared its intent to open a full external investigation, the walls inside the department started sweating. People who had once laughed off complaints now combed through their own inboxes, double-checking who they had CC'd, what they had ignored, and how often they had written the words, "Incident resolved." Internally, the department wasn't built for transparency. It was built for containment, for looking decisive just long enough for public interest to move on. But this time, it didn't. Not because of one person, because of the pattern, the proof, and the people who decided to stop being quiet. Internal Affairs wasn't ready. Their backlog was bloated with reports coded in neutral language, buried under procedural loopholes, and filed away in storage rooms no one had entered in years. But Adrienne didn't give them the luxury of time. She issued a notice. All complaints, with matching personnel tags to read, were to be unsealed within 72 hours. Her wording was exact. Any attempt to delay or redact without stated legal cause will be considered procedural interference. That wasn't a suggestion, that was a warning. And for the first time in over a decade, someone in oversight had the public's full attention behind her. Amina kept her focus narrow. She knew how these things worked. The louder the fallout, the more fragile the accountability. If too many people asked for too much at once, the system would jam, cry overload, and default to inaction. So she moved carefully, patiently. She identified 3 former officers, now retired, who had left the force under the radar after similar community interactions. She built a timeline, cross-referenced city surveillance and civilian videos, and when she submitted the report, she titled it simply, "What You Miss When You Don't Watch." Inside the department, tensions were no longer under the surface. Officers split into quiet factions. Those who had always known something was wrong, but were too junior to speak out, now finally found themselves whispered to in stairwells, handed copies of old files, with notes like, "This was real," scribbled in pencil. Others, loyal to the structure, grew paranoid. They locked drawers, reset passwords, avoided eye contact in meetings. Then, one of them cracked. A mid-level lieutenant, 6 years on the force, showed up at Adrienne's temporary field office with a USB and shaking hands. He didn't ask for immunity. He didn't ask for protection. He asked for acknowledgement. "This isn't new," he said. "You know that, right? It's not one guy. It's how they teach us to think about control, about who's a risk, who's a problem, who needs to be checked. It's in the ride-alongs, the evaluations, the jokes you only laugh at once so they'll stop asking why you look uncomfortable." The USB had clips, not 1, not 10, 57. Footage saved from dashcams, cell phones, locker room conversations accidentally picked up on body mics, never turned off. Most weren't dramatic. A shoulder grabbed too hard, a bag searched without consent, a voice lowered to a growl only when no one else was around. But the pattern was unmistakable, authority used without cause, and the assumption that no one would ever piece it together. Adrienne didn't release the files all at once. She didn't need spectacle. She needed structure. She organized them, labeled them by type, by date, by officer. And she sent a message to every member of the oversight board. Before you argue against reform, look at what you already paid for. The mayor issued a statement the next day, not an apology, a pivot. The city would now move forward with a civilian-led committee to review misconduct cases dating back 7 years. It was framed as a progressive step, but people knew better. It was an act of self-preservation, trying to stay ahead of a wave that no longer asked for permission to rise. Inside the department, retaliation bloomed. Officers who spoke up found their schedules changed, their reports questioned. One received a formal reprimand for failure to maintain unit cohesion, but the reprimands didn't stick, not with the public watching, and every act of quiet retaliation only added fuel to the momentum. Amina received a call one morning from someone she hadn't heard from in 5 years, a former colleague who had left the system entirely after being pushed out for refusing to falsify a record. He said only one sentence, "It's cracking, keep pressing." And she did. She didn't ask to lead. She didn't volunteer to testify. But when asked, she agreed, under one condition. No pre-approved questions, no time limits. No redactions. The hearing was live-streamed, hundreds watched. Her voice, steady as ever, echoed in the chamber not because it was loud, but because it carried weight. She read from her notes only once. The rest she delivered from memory. "I am not here as a victim," she said, "and I am not here as a symbol. I am here because your systems are designed to outlast your memory. They don't collapse from one incident. They fracture from repeated inaction. What happened to me is not the worst I've seen. It's just the first time the rest of you stayed long enough to see it too." There were no questions after that. There didn't need to be. The moment didn't ask for answers. It demanded recognition and, for the first time in years, it got it. Later that evening, in a quiet room far from the cameras, Adrienne closed her binder, looked across the table at Amina, and said, "They're not ready for the truth, but they're more afraid of the silence now." Amina didn't smile. She just nodded. "Good," she said. "That means we're getting close." Because this wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about structure, culture, the unspoken code that said some lives were more credible than others, some bodies more interrogable, some truths less palatable, but the footage didn't lie, the audio didn't flinch, and the people watching, they finally knew what to look for, and once people know how to see, you can't make them unsee it. The moment the first foreign press article dropped, the narrative broke out of the city's control. Not because it said anything new, but because it said it louder, with more reach, and in a language power couldn't ignore. The headline ran in 3 countries by morning: "Security officer accused of targeting civilian. Oversight reveals. Pattern of abuse." It was clean, neutral on the surface, but sharp underneath. The kind of phrasing that told you exactly what you were dealing with without ever needing to shout. That's when the mayor's office blinked. They tried to get ahead of it with a curated press release and a pre-scheduled interview. But the tone had already shifted. People weren't looking for responses. They were waiting for results. Within 72 hours, journalists from France, Canada, and South Africa picked up the thread. Not just about Amina, about the system, about how familiar this script had become in cities that claimed equality while budgeting for silence. A national anchor referred to the incident not as an event, but as a signal. "We're not looking at a scandal," she said. "We're looking at a mirror." And that mirror started showing up in every inbox connected to public office. But what made the difference wasn't just the media. It was what people did after they read. A group of volunteers, some students, some retirees, some previously unaffiliated, with any movement, launched a community tracker. They didn't wait for permission. They collected public records, user reports, archived footage, and compiled it into a searchable map. 1 pin per complaint. Red if it had been closed without investigation, yellow if it was still pending, blue if it had resulted in discipline. The screen turned red fast. City officials tried to downplay it, claimed it lacked context, called it potentially misleading. But no one cared about spin anymore. They cared about pattern, and the patterns were impossible to ignore. Every pin had a name. Every name had a timestamp, and every timestamp carried the question, why didn't anyone stop this sooner? Amid the noise, a new voice rose, one that didn't belong to Amina, Adrienne, or any of the existing officials. Her name was Layla, 28, born and raised 2 blocks from the plaza, not an activist by training, a former public school teacher. Her younger brother had been stopped by Reed 6 months before the incident with Amina. No video. No witnesses, just a scared teen told to watch his mouth after asking why he was being searched for walking home with headphones on. Layla had filed a complaint back then. It had gone nowhere. She hadn't forgotten. Now, with the spotlight blazing, she stepped forward, not with accusations, but with precision. Her first appearance wasn't on the news. It was in a local town hall, streamed over a shaky Facebook live feed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She just read from a piece of paper. My brother's story didn't go viral. That doesn't make it less real. It just makes it less useful to people who only care when the camera's on. We don't need attention. We need change. The clip was raw, grainy, but it traveled fast. Her words ended up quoted by an international reporter covering institutional reform in urban policing. And that's when the attention changed, not from outside pressure, but internal shift, because Layla wasn't polished. She wasn't handled. She spoke with the kind of unfiltered clarity that made talking points look like fiction. And people listened. She was invited to speak again and again. She declined most offers. She didn't want to be a face. She wanted to be a force. Within a month, she and a small team had drafted what they called the Community Dignity Bill. It wasn't radical. It was direct. 3 core provisions: mandatory civilian oversight for all complaints involving physical contact, automatic suspension of any officer under investigation for abuse of power, permanent public record access for any incident logged more than once within 5 years. It was clean, legally tight, hard to argue against without admitting what the system had been built to avoid. The pushback was immediate. Police unions cried, "Foul." Political operatives warned of overreach. One local paper ran an op-ed claiming the bill would cripple law enforcement morale. But the momentum had shifted. For every official resisting, 10 community members showed up to defend it. Teachers, nurses, shop owners, first-time voters. They didn't come with chants, they came with receipts. "This is what happened to my cousin. This is the night I filed and got no callback. This is the letter I wrote that no one read." And behind the scenes, Amina kept the structure intact. She met with Layla quietly, passed along what she'd learned, what patterns to expect, what resistance would look like when it dressed itself in formality. She didn't offer advice. She offered preparation. "You don't need to be louder," she told her. "You just need to be harder to discredit." Meanwhile, Adrian escalated her own inquiry. She submitted a formal request for federal review, not just of the department, but of the city's oversight structure. It triggered a scramble behind closed doors. City lawyers drafted contingency plans. A private PR firm was hired, but the people weren't watching the PR. They were watching the votes. And when the city council scheduled the bill for public hearing, no one expected what happened next. Over 300 people showed up. Some came from neighboring towns, others from out of state, not to protest, to testify. Each person was given 2 minutes. The hearing lasted 9 hours. And through all of it, Layla sat near the front, not speaking, not waving, just listening. Her brother beside her, hands folded, head high. It wasn't about fame. It was about being undeniable. The vote passed narrowly, 6-5. The bill advanced, not final, not yet law, but real, and that realness sent a signal stronger than any press release ever could. The morning after the bill passed its initial vote, the city didn't look different, but the air felt tighter, like people had finally exhaled, and what replaced the tension wasn't relief, it was responsibility. No one celebrated in the streets. There were no parades or viral videos. But in coffee shops and on buses, people were talking about the vote. Not just about the result, but about how long it had taken to get there. The fact that it had taken a woman being touched without consent, filmed in broad daylight, backed by federal investigation and international attention, just to get the right to say, "We deserve oversight." That was what stuck with them. Layla didn't pause. While City Council debated amendments behind closed doors, she moved forward with what mattered: infrastructure. She didn't just want a bill, she wanted permanence. So she partnered with legal scholars, data analysts, and community organizers to build what they called the Witness Registry. It wasn't a complaint form. It was a living archive. Anyone could log what they'd seen, no names required, just what, when and where. It wasn't for the courts, it was for the people, so no one could pretend later that they didn't know. At first, officials called it non-credible. They said it had no legal standing. But after 2 weeks, over 4,000 entries had been submitted, some anonymous, some signed. Most came with no proof, just presence. I saw an officer follow a teenager for 5 blocks. I heard a woman ask 3 times why she was being searched and no one answered. I remember a boy crying in the back of a patrol car while his mother yelled from the sidewalk. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was real. And that made it harder to ignore than any single headline ever could. Back inside city government, resistance turned strategic. An anonymous memo leaked from a council member's office suggested softening the bill's language, changing mandatory oversight to preferred civilian input, rewording suspension to temporary reassignment pending resource. Availability. It was legalese designed to neuter impact, but this time people noticed. The edits were posted online, compared line by line to the original, and translated into plain language by volunteers. They want you to think progress happened. One caption read, while they're busy deleting it. Layla refused the revisions. Publicly, she released a single statement. If your version protects the same people who've already failed us, it's not reform, it's a rerun. That quote ended up on posters, tweets, and t-shirts. Not because it was catchy, because it was true. Meanwhile, Adrienne finalized her oversight report. It was blunt. A 143-page summary of internal failures, cover-ups, administrative delays, and culture of passive compliance. She sent it to federal oversight, state legislators, and international human rights committees, not because she expected all of them to act, but because some of them couldn't afford not to, and when the report hit the press, it didn't break the news cycle. It rewired it. Local officials who had once downplayed the story now rushed to schedule interviews. Some apologized. Others positioned themselves as longtime supporters of change. But the public didn't forget who said nothing when it mattered. In the meantime, Amina did what she always had. She observed. She documented. She trained new investigators, reviewed public engagement protocols, helped translate parts of Adrienne's report into accessible formats. She stayed behind the scenes, not because she was hiding, but because she understood what it meant to hold a line once momentum started to shift. You don't push harder when the wheel's moving, she told Layla during one of their quiet meetings. You steer, you decide where this goes next. Where it went next was into law. 4 weeks after the first vote, the Community Dignity Bill passed in full. No soft edits, no delayed implementation, 3 dissenting votes, a dozen abstentions. But the count didn't matter, the outcome did. The city was now the first in its state to require immediate third-party civilian oversight in all public contact incidents involving force, physical search, or profiling claims. Not a perfect law, but a start. Layla didn't speak the day it passed. She stood outside council chambers, arms crossed, eyes forward, as people hugged and cried around her. Her brother was beside her, silent, focused. Later that night, she posted a photo of him at 10 years old, smiling, backpack too big for his shoulders. The caption read, "I didn't do this for me. I did it for the next kid who asks why no one." Stood up when it counted, Amina saw the post, didn't reply, just saved it, because she knew what came next, the backlash, the exhaustion, the slow erosion of public focus. Reform wasn't a finish line, it was a job, and it didn't pay overtime. But now, the silence didn't feel inevitable, it felt temporary. Months later, journalists still checked in. The plaza had a plaque now, not a memorial, just a small bronze plate embedded in the concrete. It didn't name Amina, or Reed, or Layla. It said only this: "We remember what happened here, and we remember who stayed." That line wasn't for tourists. It was for the witnesses. The ones who chose to stop, to speak, to act, whether with a phone, a word, or a vote, because what changed the system wasn't the outrage. It was the refusal to let it be temporary. It didn't feel like change. Not at first. There were no banners, no fireworks, no speeches echoing across rooftops. It was smaller than that, quieter, like the volume on something familiar had been slowly turned down, and what replaced the noise was space. Space to see, to ask, to notice. In the plaza, where everything began, people moved differently now, not because they were being watched, but because they were watching. And that shift, that quiet shift, was the first sign the city had started remembering. The first interview came from a woman no one had expected to speak. Her name was Judith, 78, owner of a tiny corner stall that sold buttons, safety, pins and thread. She'd been there for decades. When the incident happened, she saw the whole thing, but she didn't move, didn't speak. When asked why, she didn't pretend. She said, "Because I've seen worse and said nothing before. It gets easy after a while. You stop believing your voice will do anything. That's the first thing these uniforms teach you. Not fear, not loyalty, just futility." Then she paused, looked at the interviewer straight on. But that day, when she didn't look away, that stuck. That cut through all the numb. Her words weren't poetic, but they stayed. Local news replayed the clip twice, not for ratings, but because it echoed something buried in people's own habits. How quickly we rationalize silence when something wrong happens in front of us. Judith didn't cry on camera. She didn't apologize. She just admitted what most people never say, that complicity doesn't always look like hatred. Sometimes it just looks like stillness. At a nearby high school, a group of students started what they called the "Did You See" wall. Every week, someone would post a handwritten note about a moment they noticed, on the bus, in the hallway, at the store, where someone stepped in, even just a little. It wasn't activism. It wasn't curated, just recognition. A guy stood up when a woman was being yelled at in the aisle. A teacher asked the officer why they were in our cafeteria again. I saw a girl film a stop from across the street, and when the cop noticed, he backed off. One of the students, Nadia, 17, shy, usually quiet, wrote something that got shared far beyond the school. "Before this year, I didn't know silence could be taught. Now I know speaking up can be too." She didn't write it for attention, but it became a headline. Not because it was new, but because it was true. Outside a flower stand on 5th and Union, a vendor named Carmen explained it best. "People think it's about law," she said. "And yeah, laws matter. But what really changed is now everyone wonders, even for a second, if what they're seeing is okay. And sometimes that's enough to stop it." She wasn't trying to be deep. She just sold flowers. But the way she said it, no hesitation, no performance, felt like proof of something real. That change didn't need to shout. It just needed to interrupt the part of us that stopped looking. Downtown, the annual market fair saw its biggest turnout in a decade. No reason given, no campaign, just people showing up. Many said it felt like reclaiming something, not because the laws had passed, but because the plaza didn't feel like a stage for unchecked power anymore. A woman named Rena brought her young daughter and pointed to the bronze plaque set in the ground where the confrontation happened. Her daughter asked, "Who's it for?" Rena said, "Everyone who didn't pretend not to see." The girl didn't fully understand, but she nodded like she wanted to. At the university, guest lecturers on law and power were invited more often. Not the polished kind with pre-cleared slides. The real ones. Civil rights lawyers, investigative journalists. One class watched Amina's testimony and sat in silence after. No one took notes, no one asked questions, until one boy raised his hand and said, "Why did it take video for people to believe her?" The professor didn't answer right away, then said, "Because some truths only count when they're recorded." And that's the problem we're now forced to face. But not every reaction was hopeful. Some officers quietly transferred out. Others requested desk duty. There was tension at the station. Training modules were updated. Complaint review boards expanded. But inside the force, a new phrase had started spreading. "Be careful, someone might be filming." And while some used it as a joke, others didn't, because they knew the subtext had changed. It was no longer about being caught, it was about being watched. And being watched, for some, meant being accountable in ways they'd never signed up for. One officer, young, 2 years in, gave an anonymous quote to a local magazine. "We were trained to control a scene, not understand it. That's on us. But that's also on who made the system. We're not ready for what people expect us to be now." The quote went viral, not because it was bold, because it was honest. And people could feel the crack in the foundation through that honesty. Amina never responded publicly, but she kept going. One day, she walked the plaza again. Not for press, not for a statement. Just to look. No one approached her. Some recognized her. Most just moved around her, but the feeling was different. Not reverence, not discomfort, just space, and that was enough. She stood near Judith's stall. Judith looked up, smiled. "I told a girl off last week," she said, "tried to cut in line. Normally I'd let it slide, but then I thought, if she doesn't learn boundaries here, where does she?" Amina chuckled. "You're a riot, Judith." The older woman shrugged. "I'm a witness, finally acting like one." And maybe that was the clearest change of all. Not the laws, not the bills, but the number of people now willing to act like witnesses, quietly, daily, consistently. There was a teacher named Marcus who had never considered himself political. He taught middle school civics and tried to keep things balanced, both sides, objective facts, the kind of neutrality that felt safe in classrooms where too many opinions could set something off. But after the incident, something in his students changed. They asked harder questions, more direct. Why didn't the officer get arrested? Would she have been touched if she looked different? What happens if it happens again and no one films it? For a while, Marcus answered with textbook language. Then one day, he said the only thing he hadn't practiced. "I don't know. But I know now that pretending I do isn't helping you." No one mocked him. No one corrected him. They just listened. And somehow, that became the turning point in how he taught, not by dodging discomfort, but by naming it. In the cafe near City Hall, there was a young barista who used to work during night shifts and often saw uniformed officers come in and take their coffee without saying much. It was always routine, predictable, until one evening a customer, middle-aged, white, polite, leaned over and asked him in a hushed voice, "Do you feel safe here?" It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't patronizing. It was genuine. And for the first time, the barista realized that someone had noticed. He didn't answer with words. He just nodded once, slow and deliberate, like someone acknowledging not just the question, but the fact that it had finally been asked out loud. Not everyone reacted with grace. In the district office, a staffer was overheard saying, "We should have handled this quieter, kept it local," as if visibility was the problem, as if justice needed to be discreet to be effective. But the problem wasn't that people knew. It was that they had known for years and done nothing. Now, the knowing was out in the open, and the absence of action wasn't deniable. It was visible. And that visibility changed things, even in small ways. A city bus driver named Glenn told a reporter he now kept a small printed card on his dashboard. "Record if needed. I won't stop you." He didn't announce it, he didn't hand it out. He just kept it there, a signal, a choice, a declaration that presence wouldn't come with a price. He said he got the idea after reading about what happened in the plaza. "I wasn't there," he said, "but I know how many things I've seen and kept driving." The card wasn't about justice. It was about memory. So he wouldn't forget next time. One evening, a group of high school seniors gathered to paint a mural under the old overpass near the edge of the city. No funding, no announcement, just permission from a local shop owner who said, "Do what you need." They didn't paint names or symbols. They painted eyes, hundreds of them, different shapes, colors, sizes, some crying, some closed, most wide open. At the center, in sharp white text, they wrote, "We watched. We're still watching." The mural didn't go viral. It didn't need to. It stayed, and that's what mattered. Layla visited the mural one afternoon with her brother. He didn't speak for a while, just stared. Then he said, "This makes me feel like I'm not crazy." She squeezed his hand. "You're not. You just grew up in a place that pretended it didn't see you unless you caused a problem." He nodded. "Well, I'm glad we became the problem." That night he wrote his first letter to city council. He didn't sign it, just wrote, "I was the one who got stopped, and I'm still here." The letter wasn't read in chambers, but it was filed, and that meant something. At a community center, a group of elders began holding monthly storytelling circles, not speeches, not lectures, just space to say what they saw. One man spoke about the first time he was frisked at 14. A woman recalled how her mother used to carry candy in her purse to bribe officers into kindness. None of it made the news, but every story added to the collective understanding that this wasn't about a moment. It was about endurance, and how survival, when told out loud, becomes resistance. Eventually, the cameras left. Journalists moved. On other stories rose. That's how news works. But the city didn't forget, not entirely. A university added a course titled Witness and Systemic Failure. A bus route was renamed after a civil rights attorney. A non-profit launched a campaign called Stop, Stay, Say to teach bystanders how to respond to public abuse safely. These weren't transformations. They were adjustments, course corrections, the kind of shifts that don't undo what happened, but make sure it's harder to ignore next time. And through it all, Amina kept walking, not to lead, just to remind. One afternoon, a child on a field trip asked if she was the woman from the video. She didn't answer yes or no. She knelt, looked the girl in the eye and said, "What matters is what you do when you see something wrong. That's your part." The girl nodded, serious in that way children are when they sense something important has passed through the air. Then she asked, "What if I'm scared?" Amina smiled gently. "Then you remember who else is watching, and you do it anyway." That moment didn't make headlines, but it was enough, because cities don't change with laws alone. They change when ordinary people decide their silence won't be rented out to power anymore, when witnesses become participants, when presence becomes action, and when remembering isn't something we wait to be told, it's something we choose to carry. What does it mean to be seen? To be truly seen, not just glanced at or acknowledged as background noise, but held in a gaze that recognizes your existence, your dignity, your right to simply be. These are the questions a little boy asked his mother one quiet afternoon as they walked past the plaza where everything had started. He held a small sandwich in one hand, eyes wide with curiosity, as if the ground beneath their feet held stories no one had told him yet. "Mom," he said softly, "why does no one laugh over there?" His voice wasn't angry or bitter, just innocent, the kind of question that carries the weight of generations. His mother hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because," she said, "that place reminds us of what happens when people forget to care, but it also reminds us why we can't stop caring." She looked down at him, the hope in her eyes steady and clear. "We don't need heroes to save us. We need people willing to stop when it matters, willing to say, 'This is not okay, even if it's hard.'" The boy nodded, absorbing more than the words, The silent promise that change lives in the moments we choose to act, in the small refusals to look away. This story, like many before it, doesn't end with justice neatly served or wounds fully healed. It doesn't offer closure because real life rarely does. Instead, it leaves us with a reminder, quiet but relentless, that silence is a choice and seeing is the first step toward change. The woman who stood still in that plaza, the boy who captured the moment, the community that refused to stay. Silent, they are not icons frozen in time. They are witnesses, teachers, and reminders that justice is not a destination, but a journey. As you watch this, consider what it means to be a witness in your own life. What moments have you seen and turned away from? What small acts of courage can you choose today to say no to silence? This isn't just their story. It's a call to everyone who believes that fairness, respect, and dignity aren't just ideals, but responsibilities. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it made you feel something you can't quite explain, please take a moment to subscribe and join the conversation here. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Together, our voices grow louder than the silence, because every act of seeing is an act of resistance, and every refusal to look away writes a new chapter in the story of justice. Thank you for being here. Thank you for seeing.